The water had always been the heart of the West family land, a restless silver ribbon cutting through the valley, turning the old wooden wheel of the mill that had stood there for a century and a half. To outsiders it was just a relic, a picturesque reminder of a simpler time, but to Ethan West it was everything. The echo of his grandfather's laughter, the scent of wet cedar and grain, the rhythm that had lulled him to sleep as a boy. The mill wasn't just a structure, it was a heartbeat. Every morning, when he crossed the worn bridge and unlocked the heavy oak door, the familiar creak of the wheel and the soft thunder of the river reminded him that life, no matter how fragile, could still move forward. He'd taken over after his father passed, determined to preserve the legacy that ran deeper than the river itself. The townspeople admired him for it, called him stubborn but with a note of respect, as if he were holding back time by sheer will. He wasn't a rich man, but he had purpose, and that was worth more. Autumn had come soft that year, painting the woods with shades of gold and rust. The valley smelled of damp leaves and smoke from distant chimneys. Ethan worked longer hours as the days grew shorter, ensuring the old mechanisms kept turning before the frost came. Sometimes he would pause and look out over the river, its steady current gleaming beneath the morning sun, and feel a quiet gratitude that the world, despite everything, still flowed as it should. Yet, even then, there were signs that things were changing. He noticed the water seemed lower than usual, its song quieter, thinner. The wheel didn't spin with the same vigor, and the wooden trough that fed the turbine occasionally coughed air instead of water. He told himself it was the dry season, that it would pass, but unease gnawed at him all the same. In the evenings the valley fell silent but for the murmur of the current and the soft groan of wood settling under age. That silence had always comforted him. It was the sound of continuity, of belonging. But lately it carried a different weight, as though the river were holding its breath. He'd sit on the porch, sipping coffee gone cold, staring into the dim outline of the waterway, and feel something slipping away just beyond his reach. He thought about his ancestors, men who had built the mill by hand, stone by stone, when the land was raw and the river untamed. They had trusted that the flow would never cease, that nature itself had entered into an unspoken pact with them. They would care for the river, and in return, it would care for them. Ethan's only company was the old black dog, River, who slept near the hearth and followed him everywhere. The townsfolk had changed. Fewer people cared about the mill now. The world ran on electricity and deadlines, not on the turning of water wheels. But to Ethan, that steady rotation was proof that something in life could endure without being reinvented. It was, in its own quiet way, an act of defiance. Yet, even defiance can waver when the wind changes. One late afternoon, as the sun sank behind the hills and the air turned cool, Ethan leaned on the railing of the bridge, watching the current slide past. The reflection of the mill shimmered on the surface, golden and perfect, but something beneath it stirred, a strange, sluggish eddy twisting against the flow. He frowned, tracing it with his eyes until it vanished under the shadow of the trees. The dog barked once, sharply as if sensing his unease. Ethan turned toward the sound of the wheels still creaking rhythmically, unaware that in just a few days that sound, the pulse of his world, would fall silent for the first time in 150 years. The morning the mill fell silent was colder than usual, the kind of still, brittle cold that made the river seem almost fragile beneath its skin of frost. Ethan woke before dawn, as he always did, expecting to hear the faint, steady groan of the wheel turning outside his window, but there was nothing. No rhythmic splash, no creak of the wooden paddles slicing through the current, only a hollow quiet that pressed against his chest like a weight. At first he thought it was the wind or ice clogging the trough again, a problem he could fix with a wrench and an hour's patience. But when he stepped outside, the silence was complete, absolute, unnatural. The air itself felt heavy, and the only sound came from his boots crunching over the frozen grass as he made his way to the riverbank. The sight that met him stopped him cold. The river, his river, was dying. The current that had once surged strong enough to shake the wheel was now no more than a sluggish trickle winding between exposed stones. Patches of mud and silt glistened where water should have been. A few stunned fish lay half-buried, flicking their tails weakly in the damp earth. Ethan's breath misted in the air as he stared downstream toward the bend where the water vanished beneath a tangle of birches. He followed the river's line with his eyes and then began to walk, his pulse pounding harder with every step. The landscape that had always been alive with motion now felt wrong, drained, hollowed out. He hiked nearly a mile before he saw it, a thick wall of earth and rock cutting across the river like a scar. The dam was crude but solid, made of timber beams driven deep into the mud, packed tight with gravel and concrete mix. Behind it, a wide pool of still brown water had formed, reflecting the cold light of morning. And there, standing at the edge of the makeshift reservoir, was Roy Miller, Ethan's new neighbor. Roy was a man in his mid-40s, sunburned and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who liked to talk loud and make sure people knew what was his. He had moved into the adjoining property only a few months earlier, boasting about his plans to modernize the valley and build a private retreat. When Ethan had first met him, he'd offered a polite handshake, but something in the man's grin had felt off. Too confident, too casual, as if he were already assessing what he could take. Now, seeing him there with a shovel in hand and a line of orange survey stakes running along the bank, Ethan understood what that grin had meant. He climbed over the rocks toward him, his breath sharp in the cold air. "What the hell did you do, Roy?" he shouted, his voice echoing across the valley. Roy looked up, unfazed, as though he'd been expecting the confrontation. "Morning, Ethan," he said mildly, tapping the handle of his shovel against his boot. "Beautiful, isn't it? Been working on it for weeks. Thought I'd make a little pond up here. Good for the view, keeps the soil moist, helps the local wildlife too, or so the environmental folks say." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "You damned the river," he said slowly, his voice shaking. "You took the entire flow. My mill runs on that water. You've killed it." Roy shrugged, his tone slipping into that practiced condescension small-town bullies wear like armor. "Now, hold on. The river runs through my property before it reaches yours. That means I have every right to manage it as I see fit. I'm not stopping it completely, just redirecting some of it. You'll still get your trickle down there. You should be thanking me, really. I'm stabilizing the bank for both of us." Ethan's fists clenched. "That trickle isn't enough to turn a wheel, and you damn well know it. This river's been running the same way since before either of us was born. You can't just block it off." Roy smirked and leaned on his shovel. "Can't I? Look, Ethan, I did my homework. There's nothing illegal about improving water flow on private land. Maybe it's time to let that old mill rest. The world's moved on, my friend. You ought to as well." The words hit harder than a slap. Ethan stood there, the cold biting into his skin, staring at the dam that had strangled a century and a half of history in a matter of weeks. He wanted to tear it down right then, to wade into the icy water and break it apart with his bare hands, but something in Roy's calmness stopped him. It wasn't carelessness, it was certainty. The man had prepared for this. He'd studied the maps, the boundaries, the loopholes. He knew exactly how far he could push before crossing the line, and that knowledge made him dangerous. Ethan turned without another word and made his way back downriver. The wheel of the mill stood still when he returned, frozen mid-motion like a carcass. He ran his fingers along the wood, slick with frost, and felt something inside him collapse. Later, sitting by the cold hearth, he called the county water authority, explained the situation, and asked them to send someone to inspect the obstruction. The voice on the other end was polite but detached, reciting procedures as if reading from a manual. "We'll need to verify the location and ownership boundaries before any enforcement action can be considered, Mr. West," the woman said. "That process can take several weeks depending on scheduling." "Weeks?" Ethan repeated, incredulous. "My business is dying right now." "I understand, sir," she replied, though her tone suggested she didn't. "In the meantime, we advise you not to tamper with the structure without authorization. Doing so could expose you to legal liability." He hung up without saying goodbye. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Outside, the river murmured faintly somewhere beneath the ice, like a creature suffocating under glass. Roy's dam had turned a living artery into a stagnant wound, and the town that had once depended on that flow wouldn't lift a finger to stop it. Ethan sat there until the fireless hearth turned gray with dawn's light, listening to the ghosts of the mill's past, the steady hum that no longer was, and knew, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that he was standing at the beginning of a war he never asked for but could no longer avoid. The days that followed blurred together into a gray stretch of waiting, frustration, and the heavy silence of a dead mill. Ethan tried to keep himself busy repairing the shutters, oiling the gears, pretending the wheel would start again if he just believed hard enough. But every time he stepped outside, the sight of the still river broke that illusion. The air seemed different now, thinner somehow, stripped of its rhythm. He called the county again, left voicemails that went unanswered, and sent emails into the void of bureaucracy. Each time the automated replies arrived, polite and useless, he felt the same dull anger coil tighter in his chest. By the end of the week, the sound of his own voice echoing through the empty mill became unbearable. Even the dog, once restless with energy, began sleeping more, as though the quiet had lulled everything alive into a kind of resignation. Then the first letter arrived. Official seal, bold header. Water Management Division, pending investigation notice. It stated that a field review of the disputed waterway had been scheduled but warned both parties against unauthorized alterations. There was no date, no contact name, just another reminder that time moved slower for those with power. Ethan folded the letter carefully, though his hands trembled, and placed it on the kitchen table beside the stack of unpaid invoices. The grain buyers had stopped calling. The tourists who came for the heritage flour had canceled their orders. The hum of the old generator filled the nights, a poor imitation of what once was. One afternoon, he drove into town to speak with the mayor, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone with authority would listen. The mayor's office was a small brick building that smelled of coffee and disinfectant, its walls lined with photos of ribbon cuttings and local festivals. Mayor Alden was a thin man with thinning patience, his face perpetually fixed in a politician's smile that never reached his eyes. Ethan laid out his documents, land deeds, family water rights, photos of the dam, but Alden barely glanced at them. "Roy Miller's project has been reviewed," he said, leaning back in his chair. "According to the preliminary assessment, his construction falls within acceptable land use limits. He's applied for an environmental improvement grant, actually. Good for the town's green image." "Green image," Ethan snapped. "He's strangled the river. You call that environmental?" Alden sighed, steepling his fingers. "Mr. West, I understand this is emotional for you, but perhaps it's time to look forward. The mill is old. The community's changing. Maybe there's an opportunity here to adapt. Heritage tours, a museum, something less dependent on outdated technology." The words hit like stones. Ethan gathered his papers without replying. As he stepped outside into the cold, he saw Roy's truck parked across the street. The man was leaning against it, arms crossed, a lazy smirk on his face as though the whole town were his stage. "You trying to make a scene, West?" he called out. "Careful, people might think you're obsessed." Ethan ignored him and kept walking. But Roy wasn't done. "Tell you what," he continued, his voice rising, "when that inspection comes through, and they find out you've been overusing the water for years, you'll wish you'd kept quiet." Ethan turned then, slowly, the fury in him sharp enough to taste. "You think you can bully me into letting you steal what's mine?" he said, his voice low but steady. "You don't own this valley, Roy. You never will." Roy's smile didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. "Everyone owns what they're smart enough to keep," he said, climbing into his truck. The engine roared to life, and he drove off, splashing muddy slush onto Ethan's boots. That night, the power flickered out twice, and Ethan had to start the backup generator again. The hum echoed through the empty mill house, vibrating in the beams like a trapped insect. He tried not to think about Roy's words, but the unease crept in anyway. The next morning, he found new metal stakes driven into the ground near his property line, painted red, each marked with the initials RM Development. He tore one out of the earth, the sound of it snapping free oddly satisfying. But more had appeared by evening, stretching like a scar toward the forest. A few days later, two men in reflective vests appeared at the riverbank with clipboards and a small drone. They said they were with the county's environmental survey team. Ethan watched as they filmed the dam, took water samples, and jotted notes, their expressions unreadable. When he approached to ask questions, one of them, a young man with polite eyes, hesitated before answering. "Sir, we're just collecting data today. We'll send our findings to the department. You'll be notified in writing." "In writing," Ethan repeated bitterly. "That's what they all say." By the time they left, the sky had turned bruised and purple with the promise of snow. The still pool behind Roy's dam had grown larger, swallowing more of the riverbank each day. Birds no longer nested near the water. Even the frogs had gone silent. At night, when the wind carried from the north, Ethan could hear the faint metallic clang of construction, someone working under the cover of darkness, driving rebar and steel into the soil. He started taking photos, documenting everything: the rising water line, the erosion near his mill, the sediment clouding what little current remained. He sent them to the county office, to the state's environmental division, even to a local journalist he knew. Weeks passed without response. It was as if the river itself had vanished from every map except his own. Then, one evening, he returned home to find a note pinned to his front door, scrawled in black marker on the back of a flyer for Roy's Waterside Estates development. "Stop trespassing near my dam. Next time I call the sheriff." No signature, but no need for one. Ethan stared at it for a long time before crumpling it in his fist. The following morning, the sheriff's car pulled up just as he was loading tools into his truck. Sheriff Holbrook stepped out, a heavy-set man who had known Ethan since childhood. His tone was weary, almost apologetic. "Got a complaint from your neighbor," he said. "Says you've been damaging his property." Ethan laughed once, bitterly. "His property? He stole the river, and now I'm the criminal?" Holbrook raised a hand. "Look, Ethan, I know how this sounds, but you need to keep this civil. Roy's got lawyers, permits, the whole 9 yards. If you go near that dam again, it'll just make things worse." Ethan didn't answer. He simply turned away and looked toward the mill, its wheel motionless against the gray sky. The sheriff sighed, touched his hat, and drove off. The valley fell silent again, the same heavy silence that had begun to feel less like peace and more like suffocation. The war had started quietly, not with shouting or violence, but with paper, ink, and the slow erosion of truth. And as Ethan watched the stagnant pool shimmer dully in the distance, he realized Roy wasn't just taking his water, he was taking his past, his livelihood, his voice, and every day the current remained still. That theft became more complete. Winter settled over the valley like a suffocating blanket, muting every sound except the occasional groan of ice breaking on the river. The dam, he still sent letters, emails, and printed photographs, but each envelope he mailed felt heavier, as though even the paper knew it was being sent into silence. He lived now by routine, waking before dawn, walking down to the mill, staring at the wheel that no longer turned, then returning to the house to work through a list of tasks that no longer mattered. What kept him moving wasn't hope. It was anger preserved in the cold, hard, and crystalline, like the ice along the river's edge. It was early February when he met Leah Morgan. She came recommended by a retired surveyor from town, an old friend who had grown tired of hearing about the dam and decided Ethan needed someone who could actually fight. Leah was younger than Ethan had expected, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority. She arrived at the mill bundled in a gray coat, a leather portfolio under one arm, and wasted no time on small talk. "You've been sending complaints for 2 months and gotten nowhere," she said, glancing toward the still river. "That means either someone's ignoring you on purpose, or they've been told to." She crouched near the bank, brushing snow away from the frozen mud. "Show me where it used to run strongest." Ethan pointed toward the bend where the dam now stood. The current came through there, split by Stone Ridge, perfect pressure for the wheel. "My grandfather built the trough by hand. He used to say the river chose this place." Leah smiled faintly. "Rivers don't choose. People do. And sometimes they steal." They spent the next week gathering everything they could: deeds, maps, letters from the 19th century bearing the West family seal. In a folder labeled Water Use Agreement, 1923, they found something extraordinary: a notarized document signed by Ethan's great-grandfather and the county registrar, granting the West family permanent right to use the natural watercourse for agricultural and mechanical purposes, as established prior to municipal incorporation. Leah's eyes gleamed as she read it. "This isn't just sentimental history," she said. "This is a vested water right, older than any zoning regulation. It can't be revoked without due compensation or environmental cause. If the river's been diverted deliberately, you have a case." Ethan felt the first tremor of real hope since the wheel had stopped. Together they visited the county archives, poring over survey maps that smelled of dust and time. Under harsh fluorescent lights, Leah traced her finger along the blue line marking the river's course. "See this?" she said. "The original boundary predates Roy Miller's property. His deed doesn't include riparian rights beyond limited access. He can't alter the flow." She paused, frowning. "But someone updated the map last year." The new version showed a subtle shift, just enough to suggest that the dam sat within Miller's jurisdiction. A convenient redrawing, neat and official. "That," Leah said, her tone darkening, "doesn't happen by accident." They returned to the valley with copies of everything. The next day, Leah requested an official injunction to suspend Miller's construction until ownership could be verified. 2 days later, they received a response not from the county but from a private law firm representing Roy. The letter was thick, printed on heavy paper, and written in the smug language of power. It accused Ethan of persistent trespassing, defamation, and interference with lawful property improvements. It demanded that he cease all unauthorized surveillance and remove recording devices from the vicinity of the dam. Leah read it aloud, her jaw tightening. "He's trying to flip the narrative," she said. "He's setting you up as the aggressor." Ethan laughed bitterly. "He steals my river, and now I'm the criminal." That night, snow began to fall in thick, silent sheets, burying the valley in white. Ethan watched it from the millhouse window, the lamplight catching in the flakes as they drifted past. For a moment, the dam disappeared under the storm. The land returned to its old stillness, pure and undisturbed. But beneath that calm lay the same corruption, patient and deliberate. Leah stayed late, spreading documents across the wooden table, piecing together timelines, cross-referencing signatures. "If he's got people inside the zoning office," she murmured, "we'll need proof of manipulation. Emails, permit dates, anything that shows intent." By dawn, they had a plan. Leah would file a formal motion to obtain the original zoning archives, while Ethan would start talking to the few old-timers who still remembered when the mill was part of the town's lifeblood. He drove from house to house, showing photos, asking questions, gathering statements written in shaky hands. Some of the elders remembered Roy's property before it was subdivided. "That creek always flowed your way, boy," one of them said. "Back when your father ran the mill, we used to swim there. Never seen it dry a day in my life." Another handed Ethan a faded ledger from 1960, listing tax assessments that described the waterway as publicly accessible. Each testimony was another stone in the wall he and Leah were building, slow and deliberate. When Leah filed the injunction, the county finally took notice. A hearing was scheduled, but not before the State Environmental Office announced an independent inspection. The news traveled fast. Roy responded by staging a performance. He organized a cleanup event at his dam, inviting local reporters and volunteers. Cameras filmed him in gloves and a safety vest, smiling as he spoke about restoring the ecosystem and preventing downstream erosion. He called it the Miller Wetland Restoration Project. Watching the footage made Ethan's stomach twist. Leah muted the video halfway through. "He's turning himself into the hero," she said. "And you're the stubborn relic who won't let go of the past." 2 nights later, Ethan heard movement near the river. He grabbed his flashlight and went out, the beam cutting through the dark. 3 men were unloading concrete bags from a truck, stacking them by the dam. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the cold water. The men froze. One of them, tall, heavy-set, stepped forward. "Private property, mister. You best turn around." Ethan kept walking. "You're expanding it," he said, fury rising. "You're making it permanent." The man's tone stayed calm. Too calm. "Orders from the owner. You touch this, and it's vandalism." He didn't touch it. He stood there, the cold biting into his hands, until the truck's taillights vanished down the road. When he looked back at the dam, the still pool behind it reflected his flashlight like a mirror, black and endless. The sound of the water beneath the ice was faint, almost pleading, as though trapped under glass. The inspection came and went with little fanfare. The officials noted environmental alterations consistent with approved property management and left, their report vague enough to be meaningless. Leah read the summary, her voice flat. "They're protecting him. Someone higher up is making sure this stays buried." She looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and her tone softened. "You've been holding this together for too long. But don't give up. The truth is on paper now. They can't erase all of it." That night, Ethan walked alone down to the frozen wheel. He brushed the snow off the wooden paddles, tracing the grooves worn smooth by generations of motion. He could almost hear it turning again, could almost feel the vibration through the ground. For the first time, he whispered to the river, not in anger, but in promise. "I'll bring you back." The wind carried his words across the ice, and somewhere beyond the dam, unseen but certain, the trapped water shifted against its prison, restless and waiting. Spring came late that year, brittle and cold, as though the winter refused to let go. The ice melted reluctantly, and when the river finally began to move again, its flow was sluggish and wrong, diverted and beaten into submission by the dam. The air no longer smelled of water and grain, but of mud and stagnant decay. Ethan had grown quieter in those months, not out of surrender but from a steady, burning focus that frightened even him. Leah continued to work beside him, filing motions, sending letters, gathering witness statements, but progress was a word that no longer carried meaning. Every time they pushed forward, Roy's lawyers buried them in new paperwork, technicalities, and counterclaims. The dam had become more than a barrier. It was a fortress built out of arrogance and law. By mid-March, the story took a darker turn. A letter arrived from the Department of Environmental Safety announcing a temporary suspension of operations at the West Mill due to potential contamination from industrial runoff. The accusation was absurd. The mill hadn't operated in months, but the implications were devastating. The notice was public, which meant anyone in town could see it. Within days, gossip began to spread. People whispered that Ethan's mill had been polluting the river, that maybe Roy's project was an act of environmental salvation after all. The local paper ran a small feature titled "Old Mill Under Investigation for Water Pollution Allegations." It quoted anonymous sources, who claimed to have seen oil leaking into the water. Ethan read the article 3 times, his hands shaking, then folded it neatly and set it aside without a word. Leah, however, wasn't as calm. "They're manufacturing a narrative," she said, pacing the room. "They can't win on legality, so they're poisoning public opinion instead." Ethan didn't reply. He stepped outside, looking toward the horizon where the dam cut the river like a scar. In the pale morning light, he could see construction continuing. New fencing lined the bank, and heavy machinery sat idle near the tree line, as if waiting for orders. Roy's plan had evolved. This was no longer about a pond or irrigation. He was reshaping the entire valley, expanding the reservoir for what would eventually become his luxury housing project. Waterside Estates. The sign near the highway read, bold and glossy, promising modern living with lakeside tranquility. Every word was a knife. The following week, Leah managed to obtain internal emails from a whistleblower within the zoning department. They revealed a chain of correspondence between Roy's legal team and a deputy administrator named Grant Peters. The messages showed deliberate manipulation of environmental assessments and quiet authorization of zoning adjustments that shifted the river's boundary on paper. It was enough to expose the scheme if they could get it into court. "This is what we needed," Leah said, her voice trembling with cautious hope. "If we can verify these, we can prove collusion between Miller and the county." But that same night, the whistleblower retracted his statement. When Leah called, his phone was disconnected. The next morning, Ethan found fresh tire tracks near the mill, deep ruts cutting through the mud, and a pile of broken glass scattered by the front gate. Inside the mill house, the windows were shattered, the old photographs of his family torn from the walls. On the wooden floor lay a spray-painted message in red, "Let it die." He stood there for a long time, surrounded by the shards of memory, the smell of cold air and dust filling the silence. When Leah arrived and saw the damage, she cursed under her breath. "He's trying to push you over the edge," she said quietly. "He wants you to lose control so he can call it harassment." Ethan didn't answer. He walked to the river instead, the sound of the wind hollow in the trees, and stared at the dam. A week later, the hearing date was confirmed. Roy's lawyers submitted a motion to dismiss Ethan's injunction, arguing that no evidence supports the claim of unlawful water diversion. The courtroom was small, its walls lined with old photographs of the town's founders. When the judge entered, Roy was already there, dressed in a tailored suit, all charm and humility. He even smiled at Ethan as though greeting an old friend. The hearing dragged on for hours. Leah presented the original deed from 1923, the historical water maps and the fragments of email communication she'd managed to preserve before they vanished. Roy's attorney dismissed everything as outdated documentation with no contemporary legal standing. When Leah mentioned the missing whistleblower, the opposing counsel feigned surprise. "We have no knowledge of any such individual," he said smoothly. When Roy took the stand, he played his part perfectly. He spoke of his love for the land, his desire to restore the natural balance, and his deep respect for the town's history. "I never intended harm," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "If anything, I was trying to prevent further erosion caused by the old mill's outdated systems. It's tragic what's happened, but sometimes progress demands hard choices." Even the judge seemed momentarily disarmed. Leah countered fiercely, exposing inconsistencies, pointing out permits that didn't exist, but Roy's team buried every argument under layers of legal phrasing. When the session ended, no verdict was given. The court required further review. It was a polite way of saying, "Wait indefinitely." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Roy for interviews. He smiled for the cameras, shaking hands, talking about community cooperation. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible among them, watching the man who had stolen his river turn the world upside down with words. When Leah approached, her face was pale but resolute. "He's winning the narrative," she said, "but not the truth. We just need one more piece, something undeniable." That night, as thunder rolled over the valley, Ethan stood by the window of the mill house and watched the rain hammer against the dam. The water rose quickly, pressing against the makeshift walls until the air seemed to vibrate with tension. He imagined it breaking, imagined the river reclaiming its path, sweeping away the lies and the greed and everything else that had buried it. He could almost hear the roar of it in his mind, the sound of justice. But when the storm passed, the dam still stood, stronger than before, its swollen reservoir glinting under the pale light of dawn. And in that moment, Ethan understood what Leah had warned him about all along. Sometimes evil didn't need to hide behind violence or chaos. Sometimes it dressed in fine suits, smiled for the cameras, and called itself progress. The morning of the final hearing dawned heavy and windless, the sky the color of lead and the air thick with the smell of rain. Ethan hadn't slept. He had spent the night walking between the mill and the river, memorizing every sound, every shadow, as though preparing to say goodbye. Leah arrived before sunrise, her face drawn but determined, her coat dusted with frost. She carried a single folder, their entire case condensed into a few hundred pages of truth. "Today, we don't convince them," she said quietly as they stood by the silent wheel. "We corner them, make them admit what they've buried." Ethan nodded. There was no need for more words. The courtroom was crowded, the air electric with curiosity. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras already raised. Roy sat at the defense table, perfectly composed, his expression that same mask of calm superiority he had worn since the first day. His lawyer whispered something that made him smile, a small, cold gesture that seemed to erase years of suffering in a single motion. When the judge called the session to order, Leah rose, her voice clear and unwavering. She presented the original deed once more, then produced copies of newly uncovered correspondence, emails between Roy's development firm and the county office confirming that the dam had been built before any official permit was granted. The room shifted. Even Roy's lawyer stiffened. Leah pressed the advantage. These documents prove that construction began illegally and that subsequent approvals were falsified retroactively. The river was diverted not for conservation, but for profit. Roy's attorney objected, claiming the evidence was acquired without due process. Leah countered calmly. These records were obtained through state disclosure requests. If your client has nothing to hide, he should welcome transparency. The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Mr. Miller," he said, "is this true? Did construction begin before your permit was approved?" For the first time, Roy hesitated. He opened his mouth to speak, but Leah wasn't done. She handed over a small USB drive. "This," she said, "contains time-stamped drone footage taken by a third-party surveyor. Recordings that show active dam work 3 weeks prior to any documented authorization." The judge ordered the footage played. The screen flickered to life, showing the frozen valley from above, the outlines of the dam under construction, trucks moving through the mud, workers laying concrete slabs. The timestamp glowed unmistakably in the corner. The courtroom fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. When the video ended, Roy's calm had vanished. His lawyer whispered furiously, but the damage was done. The judge straightened in his seat. "Mr. Miller," he said slowly, "you have violated state environmental statutes and waterway preservation laws. The court will be issuing an immediate injunction. The structure must be dismantled pending investigation." The words hit like thunder. Roy stood, his voice breaking through the stunned murmurs. "You can't do that! This was approved. This is all political." The judge banged his gavel sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Miller. You'll have your chance to appeal, but your dam will come down." Leah closed her folder, exhaling for what felt like the first time in months. Ethan sat still, staring at the table, unable to move, unable to breathe. The river had been given back its voice. That afternoon, heavy machinery rolled into the valley under government order. The crews worked in grim silence, cutting into the dam's concrete heart. Roy was there too, shouting, gesturing wildly, his polished confidence collapsing into raw fury. Ethan watched from the ridge as the first breach cracked open, a dark wound that began to bleed water. The sound it tore through the mud and stone, sweeping debris into the valley, roaring past the mill that had stood patient in silence for so long. Ethan stood unmoving as the spray reached him, cold and clean. For a moment, he thought he could hear the voices of his ancestors in the water, the men who had built the wheel, the women who had kept the books, the generations who had trusted the river to carry their lives forward. Leah came to stand beside him, her hair whipped by the wind. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "No," he answered, watching the water churn and surge past the bridge. "It did it. It just needed to be free." Behind them, Roy shouted something incoherent as officials escorted him away. The valley vibrated with sound again, alive and untamed. The wheel of the mill creaked, shuddered, and with a groan that seemed almost like a breath began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster, the wooden paddles catching the revived current. The noise that filled the air was not the silence of victory or vengeance. It was the sound of something long buried breaking back into life. When the river finally settled into its rightful course, the valley changed in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. The air grew softer, the scent of wet soil returned, and the old mill began to hum again, its rhythm uneven but alive, like a heart relearning how to beat. The water no longer fought against walls. It flowed with the same steady patience that had shaped the land for generations. Weeks passed before Ethan truly believed it was over. The dam was gone, reduced to rubble that the current slowly carried away. Roy's company filed for bankruptcy soon after the court's ruling, and the Waterside Estates sign was taken down, leaving only bare posts jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. The valley had no interest in monuments to greed. Ethan spent his mornings repairing what time and silence had damaged. The gears inside the mill turned grudgingly at first, the wood swollen from months of stillness, but the sound was pure and strong. People from town began to visit again, some to help, others just to see what persistence looked like. The same newspaper that once called him a polluter now ran a headline that read, "Local mill restored, river freed by court order." He read it without triumph. The fight had cost too much to leave room for victory. He had lost months of sleep, friends who'd doubted him, and the quiet certainty that justice was ever simple. But when he stood by the water at dusk, the fading light glimmering on its surface, he knew that what remained was enough. Leah came by often, no longer carrying folders or files, just a cup of coffee and the same steady calm she had brought into his chaos months ago. They talked little about the case. Words seemed unnecessary now that the river itself had taken over the conversation. Sometimes they sat on the porch in silence, listening to the wheel turn. "You think it'll keep running another 100 years?" she asked one evening. Ethan smiled faintly. "If we don't forget why it stopped." Spring gave way to summer, and the valley bloomed again. Wildflowers spread along the riverbank, reclaiming the soil that had once been buried beneath concrete. The scars of the dam faded beneath the growth. The river ran clear and cold, whispering against the stones, carrying with it the sound of endurance. And though the world beyond the valley kept spinning faster, down here time moved as it always had, measured not by progress or profit, but by the turning of the wheel and the endless murmur of water that had finally found its voice again.